In our last session, you'll remember that we looked at the first two locations of Bible teaching and preaching of Bible communication, and you'll see them there on the screen. We looked at the study, where we kind of were really swimming deeply into the passage to see the passage purpose and passage idea, and we had a little bit of practice there yesterday. And then from that, then we said how important it is to pause at that point and to really pray for our own response, for God to be with us in our response to His words, and also to really be praying quite explicitly for the listeners, for the audience, and for their response. And so in this session, we're going to see the next two locations as we go from that passage idea to really getting into the message. And so the third location, so just to see, this is what we'll really be doing. And so you start with the Bible text at the top, and what we did yesterday is really distilling, kind of following those arrows in to going from a lot of words of the Bible text to one sentence of the purpose and the big idea. And what we're going to be looking at in this session, the arrows go back out again, going from that one single sentence in terms of the message that you are delivering to your audience or to your listeners. So the third location is the one you've all been waiting for. Is I call it the coffee shop. You can call it really whatever you want to. Again, it's not a literal place, although it can be. I call it the coffee shop location because in the UK, a coffee shop is a location to meet people. It's really become a very popular place to meet people, to watch people live their lives. People come and go to a coffee shop, and many they literally come and they go and carry on with their lives. Many times, at least in the UK, people come in and sit and chat in coffee shops. You'll have business men and women having coffees at the beginning of their day. You'll have mothers gathering, kind of filling coffee shops with prams and pushchairs. You'll have retired couples spending whole mornings just sort of together, drinking a cup of tea or coffee. You'll have school kids coming in on their break time. You have people from all sorts of life coming into the coffee shop. And the idea of this location, the coffee shop, is to prepare a message for someone or for some people. So if you have your passage purpose, your passage idea, we want to be communicating that to someone. It's not just communicating a message into the air, just into an empty room. But we're thinking today about how to kind of prepare, how to come up with a message to particular people, to real people. And so the idea behind being in a coffee shop is that you're with real people. So whether you do this part of the preparation process literally in a coffee shop where you can see people and you think, I need to be preparing this message for mothers because I can see mothers in the coffee shop. Or whether you're still in your house, in your study, at your desk, but you're thinking, okay, who's in my church this Sunday? Well, there's this group of people, there's this person, or who is in my Sunday school as I'm preparing this Bible talk. It's really just the thinking, the imagining the people who you're going to communicate to, and you need to know them. You need to know the people that you're communicating to. You need to know the world that they are in. And in everything, particularly in this kind of part of our process, we want to be biblical and clear and relevant and engaging. They're kind of the four key words that we are really thinking about when we're crafting a message, when we're thinking about how to communicate the Bible's message. We want to be biblical and clear, relevant and engaging. And then, so these are kind of the next two steps. We'll see the fifth step is to think of the message purpose, and the sixth step is to come up with a message idea. And similar to yesterday, really, so without a purpose, you won't communicate well. But without an idea, you won't communicate really anything at all. Brian Chappell suggests that the meaning of the passage is the message of the sermon. So when we go into our groups later to think back to Genesis 12, that's worth keeping in mind. That the meaning of the passage is the message of the sermon, there has to be a strong link between the passage idea and your message idea. So the passage idea has to drive the message idea that you want to communicate. It's not necessarily going to be completely identical, but the passage has to drive what we say in our message. Does that make sense? So remember, my passage that I'm giving you as an example is Matthew 1, 18 to 20. So if you remember, 18 to 25, sorry. So my passage idea was this. So after an angelic visit, Joseph married Mary and named her son Jesus, who was God with us. And I kind of felt that reflected the big things that were going on in the passage. Now, when I was preparing for this particular message, as I said yesterday, it was actually for a Christmas evangelistic service. So my message purpose was to explain the real meaning of Christmas. Now, obviously, that's quite a specific message purpose that really is kind of unique to that event. But if you're preaching through Matthew and it was February and not Christmas, the message purpose would still be, I think, quite similar. So perhaps you wouldn't talk about the real meaning of Christmas, but I think you would talk about kind of your purpose would be to explain the real identity of Jesus as we see in his birth, just something like that. But that's just an example how an event can really affect your message purpose. Now, my message idea was this. So this is remember that single sentence summary. This is the thing that I want to be driving towards people remembering. This is the thing, the idea that I want to communicate. And it's this: the heart of Christmas is Jesus coming to save and be with his people. So hopefully, because I've put the passage idea and the message idea there, you can see the links between the two. So there's that idea of Jesus coming to save in the passage. That's the meaning of his name. But also then coming to be with his people. That's the meaning of Emmanuel. And so that's how I've tried to reflect that in the message idea. The heart of Christmas, or the heart of the story of Jesus' birth, is Jesus coming to save and be with his people. And like we saw in the last session, the idea is a single sentence summary of my message. It's the thing that I want to communicate. It's the sentence that I want people in my audience to leave with, to remember. It doesn't have to be catchy. This sentence is not catchy in any way. This sentence doesn't rhyme. There's no alliteration. It just needs to be clear. And it's really helpful to have that, because as we're going to think in a second about really how to craft the message that you're going to be delivering, you have to know the idea that you're going to communicate, right? Because otherwise you're just going to be walking on a journey with no destination. So that's steps 5 and 6. We'll do questions at the end. Is that okay? So that's question. The next step that you'll have on your notes is step 7, message structure. So here we go. Remember, picture the scene. You're in your coffee shop, either literally or in your imagination. You have your passage and your message purpose and idea, and you can see your audience living their life. So you know the people in your church, you know the people in your youth group, you know the people that you're going to be meeting with that week to communicate to them. How do you share with them what God is saying through the passage that you have chosen and prepared? How do you share with them? How do you communicate your message to them? You have a message. How do you communicate it to them? Well, I think there are probably three main ways to structure an actual message. Usually, kind of this would come out in a sermon as you're preaching, but I think actually it's still relevant for how you prepare a Bible study, or even how you prepare a conversation in a real coffee shop. So there are probably 3 main ways that you can structure a message. I'll just explain them, and then in each one we'll think through together what are positives, what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of doing a message like this. So the first one is called a deductive message. So this is where basically you state your message idea right at the beginning. Like, so your introduction, you're launching straight into, this is my message idea, and then you state it as often as you can through the message. So for example, with my message idea for that Christmas talk, the introduction I would go towards saying, at the end of the introduction, so the heart of Christmas is Jesus coming to save and be with his people. And then the rest of the message, I'm going to be referring to that sentence and every point. So remember, the heart of Christmas is Jesus coming to save and be with his people. And then you can talk a bit more about what that means about Jesus being with his people. So remember, the heart of Christmas is Jesus coming to save and be with his people. Some of us think that Christmas is all about just presents or Father Christmas, or it's about food. But the real heart of Christmas is Jesus coming to save and be with. Does that make sense? So that would be a deductive message. And that is a triangle of kind of how you can picture. So you have your one sentence at the top, the point, and then you're developing that one sentence and repeating it as you go. Then one of the potential, I think, disadvantages of this structure is that if I say something, it could be anything that I say is true and you disagree with that statement, I have to do a very good job of trying to convince you. So deductive is kind of the most simple. It's basically, this is the big idea, this is what I'm going to tell you about, and then I'll keep telling you about it. The other way is kind of the other side of the triangle. This is where I think, which is where we're feeling we want to go to in some of your comments. This is where the message idea is the climax of your message. So what you're doing here is a lot more of that. You're examining the issues, you're raising questions, you're raising tensions, and then your big idea is kind of this is God's answer to the questions that we've seen. So can you notice the difference? So either you're saying, this is the answer, let me repeat it, let me try and prove it, let me explain it, and there's that clarity and I think it's more memorable potentially that way, but it's also potentially boring because you're just saying the same sentence over and over again. When writers write detective novels, fiction, they need to know kind of the big climax, and then they work everything out, and then they write from beginning to end, right? And that's very much exactly what we're thinking with here. When you know the idea you want to communicate, how are you going to communicate it? And there's no real rules of how you communicate an idea, but these are some things. The third option, something we call narrative, and that is basically a combination. So you're starting kind of with the big kind of text, the big story, and then you're kind of telling the story, narrowing in, and then you're having some kind of climax with a big idea, and then you're expanding it. And again, we can talk more specifically about how you do that. But how do you choose which one you do? I think for me, usually it's just a question of how brave I'm feeling, to be perfectly honest with you. Am I feeling brave enough to do inductive and to kind of risk losing people along the way? And that takes courage and it takes practice. Deductive is the simplest. It's probably best for people who are just starting preaching. It's probably best to try and focus on a deductive structure, at least at the beginning. But really the question is about your audience more than anything else. It's about who are you preaching, who are you communicating to, and it's more about the passage you're teaching. Perhaps you're teaching or communicating a passage that has its own obvious structure like this. Again, if you're preaching evangelistically, we'll think about that in another session. Then it's a real question: do I want to be really clear and methodical about repeating the big idea, or do I want to almost be a bit more subtle and kind of try and get behind people's defences and try to convince people that way? There's no real right or wrong. There's no real kind of rules of how you do it, but they're just kind of helpful, and you need a structure on which to focus how you communicate what you're doing. And then the final section, or at least the next section, the next step, It's probably one of the hardest in many ways. Message detail. This is where we actually plan what we say and how we say it. Now, I think there's always 3 sections in a message. Not always 3 points. There's not always 3 points, but there's always 3 sections. There has to be a clear introduction. There has to be the body of the message, and there has to be a conclusion. For something to be a message, there has to be those 3 things. There has to be an introduction. There has to be the stuff you're saying, the body. There has to be a conclusion. And introductions and conclusions are arguably the most important. Introductions and inclusions are super important, but me, if I was being honest, they're probably the things I spend the least time on. I think I normally would spend the most time on the body of the message, and then I'll just add on an introduction, and the conclusion will just be pray. Like when it's not going very well, that is typically what I would do, and that's not really helpful because introductions motivate our listeners to listen. And we said that in some of the comments you made. A clear introduction will motivate people to listen to you, and they'll motivate them to move them closer to Christ. So the introduction needs to show relevance. It needs to be engaging, and it needs to be relevant. Essentially, you're trying to answer the question, why should I listen to what you're saying? In your introduction, if you answer that question somehow, then it's a good introduction, and people will come with you on that journey that we were describing. And then the conclusion, good conclusions are so valuable. The conclusion, if the introduction kind of takes off and starts the journey and gets people on a journey with you, the conclusion is really you have to land the journey safely. You have to know where you're going before you start the journey. I don't know if you saw in the news, it was a month or 2 ago, and it was in the British news because there was a British Airways flight that was flying from London to Dusseldorf. And they took off, and it was, by all accounts, a really smooth flight, very simple flight. They landed, and the captain, the pilot, came on, and he said, "Welcome to Edinburgh. We have arrived at Edinburgh." And obviously the passengers were a little bit confused because they were supposed to be in Germany, which is there, not Edinburgh, which is up here. And basically they hadn't reset the flight computer, and they had all just flown up to Edinburgh in Scotland instead of east to Germany, which, even if the flight itself was perfect, and no one was very happy because they're not in the right place. And that's very much like a conclusion. You can do a technically excellent message. You can communicate, in a really good way. But if you land in the wrong place, or if you don't land at all, that's more my problem, not landing. But if you land badly, it doesn't matter how good the flight was. If you land badly, the best way to conclude, the best way to land a message is to stop talking. And I find that annoyingly hard because I don't ever really conclude. I just kind of keep talking. Because I don't work on my conclusion enough usually. I'm there I just talk until I can find something that sounds a bit profound and is the end of a paragraph. And so I just keep talking, and I keep trying to find this killer final line, or I just keep repeating the same thing, or I remember something I've missed out from back over here, and I do that all the time. Or I'm just repeating stuff, and then eventually I just run out of steam and just kind of crash land. But to spend time crafting a conclusion is really important. To land well really helps. But the body, so that's introduction, that's conclusion. The body of your message is where you're adding all the details. It's where you're kind of adding kind of all the bits, all the meat, all the things that you're wanting to say and to colour in your big idea. And in everything, particularly in the body, in everything, you're trying to illustrate your passage and your message big idea. And we can illustrate in lots of different ways. But really, in terms of illustration, you're just talking about explaining something or proving something or applying something. Illustration is not just telling a story. By illustrating, you are explaining or proving or applying. Sometimes you can do all three, kind of at the same time in the same thing. But illustrating is not just that you have to have stories or jokes every paragraph. That's not illustrating. Illustrating is explaining, proving, or applying the point that you're trying to make. And again, there are no kind of biblical rules about message structure. You're completely free with how you structure every message. In the UK, we have this stereotype that every message has to be 3 points beginning with a P. Maybe you have similar things in your countries too, but there's no rule about how you structure a message. But how you structure it is really, really important. Do all you can to make your message visual, to make it come alive, to make your message real. Spend time in the coffee shop planning your introduction with specific people in mind. How can I communicate this passage's big idea to the single mother that sits here when I preach? How can I communicate the passage's big idea and my message big idea? How can I communicate that to the 16-year-old in my youth group who is just starting to date someone? How can I communicate this message big idea to these people who are retired and have been Christians for 60 years? How can I communicate this to people who became a Christian last week? How can I communicate this to someone who isn't a Christian yet? They're the kind of questions that we're thinking of in the coffee shop. And also it's really important just to review what you're preparing and keep thinking, remember those 4 key things. Is it biblical? Is it clear? Is it relevant? And is it engaging? Let me just kind of quickly do this final location, super quick, and then we're going to have to go straight to groups, I think, to have a practice. So the location 4 is the pulpit, and we call it the pulpit because it's a location of where a lot of us will be delivering our message. But essentially, it's just a place where you communicate your message. It doesn't have to be a pulpit. It doesn't have to be standing at the front of church. It can be in a conversation. It can be in a Bible study. But essentially, just a couple of things just to throw out for us to think about is we need to be, I think just generally in the church in Europe, we need to be better at thinking through how we deliver, how we physically deliver messages and ideas. We need to think more about our voices and how we speak and how we kind of speak clearly and loudly enough. We need to think better about how we pause and use pausing and stopping in how we speak. Maybe we want to use pauses. They can really, some pauses can be louder than shouting. They can be a really big impact. But using pauses well, using hand gestures is really important. One thing that I recommend if you're feeling really brave and not at all self-conscious is if you, next time you preach or you lead something, is to film yourself. I'm very conscious there's a camera there looking at me. Film yourself communicating your message. And probably it'll be like the experience that I'll have when I watch this back. It'll be very harrowing because I'll see that I've been doing some weird hand gesture that I've never done before that's really off-putting. I remember someone told the story once, and when they preached, they kept kind of doing what we called a bear roar, and for some reason they just kept preaching, kind of going. They didn't do a roar, but they just kept doing that. Or I don't know, just hand gestures, kind of verbal things that you can say that you don't know you're doing. But it's I really recommend, again, do it when you're feeling brave. Do it with friends, but listen to your recording, listen to a video, and just see how your gestures do. Because again, we want to be natural and engaging, and we definitely don't want to be fake. So here we go. So there you go. From text to talk. Remember it's these relationships, these 3 relationships of Bible teaching. Remember the arrows of where we're going.